Hello, and welcome to the Denver Democracy Summit. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and it is my great pleasure to welcome to the Denver Democracy Summit the 66th U.S. Secretary of State and current Director of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and our alumna, Condoleezza Rice. Welcome back to Denver.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be able to talk with you today about a somewhat depressing topic, threats to democracy. Let me start with, sadly there are many, but let me start with the problem of disinformation. You know, democracies have been vulnerable to disinformation forever, and something the founding fathers even worried about. But it does seem like in today's cyber media environment where fictions travel faster than fact, it seems the danger is even more acute. The first question might be just how vulnerable are the US and other Western democracies to disinformation from abroad?
Well, there's no doubt that we are vulnerable to disinformation, and some of it's sophisticated and some of it's not very sophisticated. I've looked at some of the Russian disinformation, and some of it you can tell those aren't Americans speaking. And so one thing is to give people kind of the tools to discard disinformation. It's also really important that we recognize that much of this disinformation is aimed at stirring up trouble between our groups that might have deep divisions. So one answer is get rid of the divisions, and the disinformation won't have the same effect. But it's also a matter of making sure that we actually have good sources of information for our democracy. And that worries me more than even the disinformation side in the way that we get our information these days. We go to our tribe, we go to our cable news channels, we go to our aggregators, our websites. Sometimes we never encounter anybody who thinks differently. So the echo chamber that we live in makes disinformation even more powerful. And so I think you have to work at the echo chamber problem. The other thing I would say is on the flip side, authoritarians are vulnerable to the truth. Everybody goes back to the glories of the days of Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. And you know that our namesake, Dr. Korbel, ran a kind of free Czech radio out of London during the war. Those were not propaganda machines. They just told the truth to populations that knew they weren't getting the truth from their leaders. And so, yes, we have to worry about disinformation, but we need to fight back with the truth in authoritarian regimes, which cannot handle it.
Yeah. Well, you know, speaking of authoritarian regimes, because you began your career as a scholar of the Soviet Union, and you've been really a close witness to the rise and the fall of democracy in Russia. I'm curious, big topic, of course, but what lessons can we learn from what's happened to democracy in Russia?
The most important lesson from what happened to democracy in Russia is not about the DNA of the Russian people. Right? So it's not that somehow Russians are unable to function democratically. It really has to do with the fact that the institutions, the kind of nascent institutions of democracy, really starting back in the Gorbachev era, when he was beginning to get rid of the single party state, when the press was becoming freer, when he was actually trying to make the Duma, into the parliament, into something real. And then Yeltsin comes along, and those nascent institutions never took hold. Rather, what happened was Yeltsin, who we think of as a great purveyor of democracy, actually went around the institutions. He never let the parliament become an important institution. He would simply rule by decree. And that then weakens this fundamental importance of not having one man have all the say. Now, when you have a strong presidency like you had under Yeltsin, it's one thing when it's Boris Yeltsin. When it becomes Vladimir Putin in 1999, now the strong presidency takes on a whole different character. So how do institutions matter? They matter because you have several of them. You have an executive, you have a legislature, you have judiciary that's independent, you have civil society, you have a free press, and you have the importance of the people being able not to just be dependent on the whim of one person. I always said the most important thing is who's your president at the beginning. And Americans were really lucky that George Washington didn't want to be king. He probably could have been.
Yes.
Many years later, I met Nelson Mandela for the first time. And President Bush asked him a really interesting question. He said, "Why didn't you run for another term?" He said, "I wanted African leaders to know it was okay to step down." And then he laughed. But think about that.
Yeah.
This man who was everything, who was the embodiment of South African democracy, understood that the institution of the presidency was more important than the individual. And so what happened in Russia in that way is a tragedy, but it's a story about the absence of institutions, not the absence of Russian DNA.
Well, let's pick up on that and talk the role of institutions, and maybe we could look at the state of American institutions. The U.S. has long been a model for other countries, an inspiration for democracy's champions around the world. What damage has the apparent dysfunctions of American democracy and American political institutions, the polarization and hyperpartisanship and gridlock, and I guess in particular the spectacle of January 6th, done to our standing in the world and our ability to promote democracy elsewhere?
Well, I don't mean to sound as if I'm dismissing the potential for damage of all that you've outlined. We've had a tough time with our democracy recently. But democracies are going to go through tough times. You don't finish the work of democracy and then it goes perfectly from there. You have these challenges to the institutions. You have these moments when it looks like the institutions might even break down. And yes, our polarization, our inability to get things done at the federal level, it's hard to go out and say, boy, this is a great system. But I say a couple of things to when I'm talking to people abroad. First of all, for those in aspiring democracies, remember too that the United States also has states and localities. The founding fathers did not leave everything in the hands of the federal government. And if you look at states and localities, they very often are the more effective and efficient levels of government. So that's the first point. The second is what we saw on January 6th, I would argue, was actually an affirmation of American institutions. Institutions somehow have to have more than a sense that they're just a place where people play out their interest. They have to have some normative power. And if you look at what happened on that awful day, and it was a horrible stain on our democracy, but then that night, when the senators and the Congress people just filed back into the Capitol, I watched that night, Fritz, and it was almost boring. The vote from Nebraska is 3 for Donald Trump, 3 for Michael Pence. The vote from California is, and I thought, my goodness, thank God for Madison, Hamilton, and by the way, Mike Pence, who recognized that he was not above the institutions. And so our institutions held. Now, there were some scary moments there. I've reflected on the fact that at one moment there, all of the presidential successors, except the Secretary of State, were in that building. Yes. That's a little frightening, and I'm not sure we want to do that again. But so that's to people who are aspiring. To authoritarians, I would say when the vice president to Xi Jinping, if he can find his vice president, can say, you have been voted out of office. Or when the vice president of Vladimir Putin can go before the Duma and say, President Putin has lost the election, then you can lecture me on the frailties of democracy.
I also reflect on January 6th was a disturbing day, and I think you're right that at the end of the day, what was amazing was that the machinery worked. I mean, the traditions held, etc. And also, on that day, I'd written something myself on sort of a statement about what was happening and reflected on what had happened the day before. So regardless of who you wanted to win in Georgia, what you had was this remarkable turnout, and then you had the people, Republicans in charge of the machinery, who in fact favored the Republican candidates, who said, no, this is what happened. And so, to your point about states and the role of states, but also about the importance of these institutions, they did hold. Let me add, so just coming back to that's what happened there. What's your sense, though, of the way in which this, that day, but even more generally, people around the world are perceiving American democracy? I mean, is our image tarnished, or is that overstated?
Oh, no, I think there are people who, particularly authoritarians, who are saying, well, look at what happened there. Look at what happened there. That's why I think we have to flip the narrative. We have to say, how well would you have come through this? Madison once said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Yeah. Well, I would paraphrase and say, if men were angels, we wouldn't need institutions. We would rely on individuals. But the strength of American democracy is we don't rely on individuals. And even when we have a challenge from a president who decides not to accept the outcome of the elections, we somehow get through it. I had an experience in Kenya when I was Secretary of State that speaks to this, because it's not just about American democracy, which is, a couple centuries old, and maybe that's why the institutions hold. What you really have to look at is how over time do institutions gain this normative value? That's how I think we need to think about it. So in 2007, 2008, the Kenyans had a really bad election, very close, very kind of tribally based. And it was contested. And I went there with Kofi Annan to help them work out a power sharing arrangement between the protagonists. And they got through it. The next time around, they had a similarly close election. Oh, by the way, there was about 1,000 people died in that 2007-2008 period because it was very violent. Because anything that's tribally based is going to be violent. So fast forward to their next election. This time around, it was closely contested, it was tribally based, and they said, we're taking this to the Electoral Commission to resolve it. I thought, wow, okay. Now that's progress, right?
Yeah, yes.
We send our people into the streets. And do you know when I knew that Kenya was going to make that transition? I knew it when I saw the headlines in 2008 when I landed to help Kofi Annan. Every newspaper in Kenya, every news story in Kenya was, don't destroy our democracy. And that said to me that it had started to sink into the Kenyan population that there was something of value here. So this is a long process. And when we talk about, the failures of democracy or the democratic recession or retreat, we have to remember that there will be setbacks. But if we look at where we were in 1980 or 1970, we've come a long way in terms of global democracy.
Let me turn now to some new threats to democracy, climate change and pandemics like we're seeing with COVID. These are immensely disruptive events, one more slow motion than the other, obviously, but they require a lot of citizens, changes of behavior. They require effective government. Some have argued that democracies are handling this not as well, more poorly than authoritarian regimes. And look at the success of China, apparent success of China, for example, in handling the COVID pandemic. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that they're different. On climate change, I really do believe democracies are responding better. Whether it is that most of the innovation, look, where are the only electric cars that people want to drive? Where are they being invented? They're being invented in places like the United States because of the creativity that the private sector and private enterprise allows. Individual citizens are taking their responsibility. People don't want to use plastic bottles anymore. I mean, I think and the innovation that will ultimately give us battery technologies and like that, I will bet on democracies. Now, when it comes to, I should just add, I'm an old Soviet specialist. When we actually took the mask off of the Soviet Union, we recognized that they'd been terrible to the environment. You had landfills in Hungary. You had the fact that the first actual civil society groups were around the poisoning of Lake Baikal. Democracies do better on something like this. But on COVID, let's give authoritarians their due. Maybe the Chinese, because they were willing to lock people down at gunpoint, because they were willing to cut off whole cities if necessary, to heck with what happened to the people within them. Maybe in the short term they can do better. But I would just ask people, would anybody trade being a Chinese citizen for the period of COVID? You don't get to be an authoritarian for a little while and then a democracy later on. We had to depend on 300 million Americans to do the right things. We are a federal system, so it was uneven from state to state. But if we take the attitude that we will go back and we will look and see what worked and what didn't, so that we actually do have a sense of what the right practices are, I'll bet we can feed that into our democratic processes the next time around. Governors don't want to fail, mayors don't want to fail, and I think our democracy the next time around will probably respond better.
Well, you've already turned many of the questions about threats into in a positive vein. It is easy, I think, at this point to look at trends around the world and to be somewhat pessimistic about the state of democracy. I wonder if you could say, just in the remaining time that we have, just a few words about things that you see that are hopeful. And of course, you've emphasized the importance of institutions. So maybe those places where you really do see a strengthening of democratic institutions.
Well, let me start with the United States and work outward to the rest of the world. I think we do have our challenges. We are polarized. We don't know each other very well anymore. We're two coasts. We are elite and not elite. Sometimes I think that ordinary people think elites look down on them. There are a lot of challenges. But not only can our political institutions deal with this, I believe, but one of the great strengths of American society is civil society. And when I look at the way civil society has responded to COVID, when I look the way civil society responded to the awful events of the George Floyd murder, when I look at the way civil society takes on food insecurity or neighbor helps neighbor, I think that's actually the strongest read of democracy. You know, when de Tocqueville came to the United States in 1835 to try to understand who were these Americans, one of the things that surprised him was what he called these voluntary associations. You know, people got together just to try to do good. We would know them today as Boys and Girls Clubs and American Red Cross and Rotaries and the like. It's not that they are a substitute for government, but they are a reason that citizen taking responsibility for citizen forms a stronger basis for democracy than anything else. And that's very hopeful for me. I'm hopeful about younger people. I see their tremendous energy. They want to do things bigger than themselves. I believe there's another institution we would do well to look at, national service. We don't know each other very well anymore. As I said, you know, Fritz, I remember after the 2016 election, our colleagues, our academic colleagues, it was almost a little bit like an anthropological dig. Let's go see what those people in Alabama think. You know, the most popular book was Hillbilly Elegy, because we didn't know. Maybe we could get to know each other. And if I had kids, students taking that gap year, working in a place that they would otherwise not know those people, maybe that could strengthen us too. Yeah. But when I look out at the world, I have to say, yes, there are some setbacks. Hungary is a setback under Orban. Poland is going through a great deal. So that great flash of democracy in Eastern Europe is having some setbacks, but not all over Eastern Europe. And even in those countries, institutions are fighting back. And so I look at places in the Middle East. You know, the Iraqis are struggling, but I'd rather be Iraqi than Syrian. They have a government that tries to be responsive, that doesn't put millions of people into mass graves. Democracies ultimately, we just have to keep believing in what political scientists now call the democratic peace. The more democracies you have, they don't fight each other. They don't create child soldiers. They don't harbor terrorists knowingly. And they don't abuse their citizens knowingly. We have to give democracies around the world capacity to deliver for their people, because we know one thing: when people vote their governments into office, they expect a lot of them. But the final thing that makes me hopeful is people still want it. When I hear people say, oh, you know, they would rather have security and stability than democracy, I always reflect on the fact that that comes from people who are lucky enough to live in democracies. And then to say those incredibly patronizing things about people who don't have the same rights that we have. And because I believe in the universality of the desire to say what you think, worship as you please, be free from the knock of the secret police at night, and have the dignity that comes with choosing those who would govern you, I'll bet on democracy long term.
Well, Condi, I'm afraid we're out of time, but that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for leadership. Your leadership of my favorite institution in the world. Don't let Stanford know that I said that. The Corbell School, which gave me my start. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And thank you, all of you in the audience, for joining us today. Stay with us, please, for the next session coming up immediately after this, which is Protecting Democracy from Disinformation, the Case of Taiwan. Thank you all, and thank you again, Condi.
Thank you. Great to be with you.